The Draconian hegemony had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years, and in all that time they had never lost a war against anyone or anything that dared to stand. Against them, Fleet Admiral Varth Kess stood on the command bridge of the Eternal Dominion and watched the blue planet grow larger on his view screen, and he felt nothing but boredom, because this was just another conquest and another primitive world that would fall beneath the weight of Draconian might. His scales were dark green, and his eyes burned like molten gold, and when he spoke, every officer on the bridge listened, because Varth Kess had personally overseen the subjugation of 37 species, and he had never once failed. "What do we know about them?" he asked his intelligence officer. The officer pulled up data on the holographic display and began to read from the scan results that their probes had gathered over the past several months. They call themselves Humans, Admiral, and they have only recently achieved spaceflight within the last century or so, and their technology is primitive by our standards, and they still use chemical propulsion and fossil fuels, and their weapons are based on explosive projectiles and crude nuclear devices. Varth Kess made a sound of dismissal deep in his throat. Tier 7 then. Yes, and Maryland's standard classification protocols apply, and we estimate full planetary conquest within 3 standard days and complete integration within 2 weeks. The Admiral nodded slowly and turned to look at the 3,000 warships that followed behind the Eternal Dominion in perfect formation, and each ship was a masterpiece of destruction, capable of leveling cities from orbit and carrying thousands of soldiers. Trained from birth for war, 2 million Draconian warriors waited in those ships, and they were eager for battle, even if this battle would be nothing more than a slaughter of primitives who did not know their place in the galaxy. "Send the standard ultimatum," Varth Kess commanded. "Give them 1 rotation of their planet to surrender unconditionally, and if they refuse, then we begin the cleansing." The communications officer nodded and transmitted the message on every frequency the humans used. And the message was simple and direct, as it always was. "People of this world, you have been chosen for integration into the Draconian hegemony, and you will surrender all military assets and government control immediately, and your species will serve the hegemony as workers and soldiers, and resources and resistance is not advised, because resistance means extinction, and you have 1 planetary rotation to comply." Varth Kess did not wait for a response, because primitives always responded delays. Same way with fear and confusion and desperate attempts at negotiation, and none of it mattered because the outcome was already decided. He ordered the fleet into descent formation, and the 3,000 warships began their approach toward the blue world called Earth. That was the last transmission the Draconian hegemony ever received from the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet. 6 galactic standard months passed, and in all that time, there was nothing but silence from Admiral Kess and his armada. And at first the Hegemony Council assumed it was a communication malfunction, because surely nothing could have gone wrong with such an overwhelming force against such a primitive enemy. They sent repair ships to check the communication relays, but the relays were working perfectly. They sent fast courier vessels to make contact with the fleet, but the couriers found nothing except empty space, where 3,000 warships should have been. They sent long-range probes to scan the human homeworld, and the probes showed something that made the council members stare at their screens in disbelief. Earth was still there, and it was completely intact, and the human cities were still standing, and the humans were still going about their daily lives, as if nothing had happened, and there were no Draconian ships in orbit, and no occupation forces on the ground, and no signs of battle damage anywhere on the planet. It was as if the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet had simply ceased to exist. High Counselor Draven Soth convened an emergency session of the full Hegemony Council, and 12 of the most powerful Draconians in the galaxy gathered in the Great Chamber on their homeworld to discuss something that had never happened before in their entire history. "This is impossible," said War Minister Krath, and his voice was thick with denial. No primitive species could defeat an armada of that size, and Admiral Kess was our finest commander, and those were our best ships and our most experienced soldiers. And yet they are gone, replied Intelligence Director Celine, and she was the only female on the council, and also the most pragmatic. We have no distress signals and no battle recordings and no debris fields and no bodies and nothing to indicate what happened to 2 million of our warriors. Perhaps they encountered something else, suggested another counselor. Some unknown threat in that region of space that destroyed them before they reached the planet. The probes show no evidence of that, Selene countered. And our scans detected no other civilizations in that system, and no anomalies, and no natural phenomena that could destroy an entire fleet. High Counselor Dravensoth raised his hand, and the chamber fell silent. There is only one conclusion, he said slowly. Something on that planet or something about those humans destroyed our fleet. And we must know what it was, because if we do not understand this threat, then we cannot protect ourselves against it. The Council debated for hours about what to do, and some wanted to send another fleet to burn the human world to ash, and others wanted to quarantine the system and pretend the humans did not exist, and others wanted more information before making any decisions. In the end, they agreed on one thing, and that was the need for answers. They would send an investigator to Earth, and this investigator would make peaceful contact with the humans and learn what had happened to the 3rd Expeditionary Fleet, and then the Council would decide how to respond, but they would not send a Draconian because Draconians were too proud and too aggressive, and they might provoke whatever had destroyed the Armada instead. They would send someone expendable and someone who could appear non-threatening, and someone who had nothing to lose. They would send a Veth, and so the order went out across the hegemony, and the fate of the galaxy began to turn on the actions of a single alien woman who had no idea what she was about to discover on the small blue world called Earth. Kira Selen had served the Draconian hegemony for 40 years, and all that time she had never questioned her place in the galaxy. Because questioning was dangerous, and questioning got people killed, she was Veth, and the Veth had been conquered. 3 centuries ago, when her ancestors made the mistake of believing they could resist the hegemony, and now her people served as bureaucrats and translators and analysts and all the other jobs that were too boring or too dangerous for Draconians to do themselves. Kira had gray skin and large dark eyes, and she was small compared to the towering reptilian Draconians, and she had learned long ago to make herself invisible and useful and quiet when the Council summoned her and told her she would be going to Earth. She understood exactly what they were doing, and they were sending her because she was expendable, and because if the humans killed her, it would cost the hegemony nothing. She accepted the mission without complaint because refusing was not an option, and because somewhere deep inside her, there was a curiosity that had never quite died despite all the years of servitude. She wanted to know what had happened to the Armada, and she wanted to know what kind of species could make 3,000 warships disappear. Her ship was small and unarmed and painted with diplomatic markings, and she approached Earth, broadcasting peace signals on every frequency she could find, and she half expected to be shot down before she even reached the atmosphere. But nothing attacked her and nothing challenged her, and she descended through the clouds and landed in a field outside a large human city, and then she waited. They came within hours, and they came in vehicles that rolled on wheels and flew through the air, and they surrounded her ship with soldiers carrying those primitive projectile weapons, and Kira stepped out with her hands raised to show she meant no harm. The humans stared at her with expressions she could not read, and some looked afraid, and some looked angry, and some looked curious, and all of them looked tired, like people who had been through something terrible and survived. They took her to a building in a city called Geneva, and this building was filled with representatives from different human factions, because apparently humans had not unified under a single government, and they still divided themselves into groups called nations. Kira found this strange because the hegemony had always assumed that any spacefaring species would have achieved global unity, and yet here were the humans still arguing among themselves even after facing an alien invasion. A woman with silver hair approached her, and this woman moved with the confidence of someone who held great power, and her eyes were sharp and calculating. "I am Secretary General Chun," the woman said, "and I speak for the United Nations, which is as close to a unified human voice as you will find, and you are the first alien to visit our world peacefully, so I hope you will forgive us if we are cautious." Kira bowed her head respectfully. "I am Kira Solen, and I'm an investigator for the Draconian hegemony, and I have not come to threaten you or make demands, and I have only come to ask questions about the fleets." Secretary General Chun said, and it was not a question. "Yes, and my superiors want to know what happened to Admiral Kess and his armada, and 3,000 warships and 2 million soldiers do not simply vanish without explanation." The humans in the room exchanged glances, and something passed between them that Kira could not identify, and it was like they were all sharing a secret that amused them and frightened them at the same time. "There is no fleet," the Secretary General said simply. "That is not possible," Kira replied, "and I mean no disrespect, but the third expeditionary fleet was real, and it came to your world, and it cannot have simply disappeared." And yet it did. The Secretary General smiled, and that smile made Kira feel cold, despite the warmth of the room. "You are welcome to stay and investigate," the human leader continued, "and we will give you access to our records and our people and our history, and you may ask any questions you like and go anywhere you wish, and we have nothing to hide from you." This surprised Kira because conquered peoples always had something to hide, and victims always had secrets, and yet here were the humans offering complete transparency. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help me? And why would you cooperate with the hegemony after what we tried to do to you?" Secretary General Chun leaned forward, and her eyes locked onto Kira's. "Because we want you to understand," she said, "and we want you to go back to your masters and tell them exactly what happened here, and we want them to know what we are and what we are capable of, and we want them to be afraid." Kira felt something she had not felt in decades, and it took her a moment to recognize. "It is fear. We are not monsters," the Secretary General added. "And we did not want war, and we do not want to conquer anyone, and all we want is to be left alone. But if anyone threatens our home and our people, then we will respond, and we will not stop responding until the threat is eliminated completely." She stood up and gestured toward the door. "You have 2 years to complete your investigation, and my people will assist you. And at the end of those 2 years, you will return to the hegemony and deliver your report, and what you do with what you learn is up to you." Kira spent the first month simply trying to understand human culture and human history and human psychology, and everything she learned confused her more than the last thing she had learned. These people were contradictions wrapped in contradictions, and they were capable of incredible kindness and incredible cruelty, and they loved deeply and hated deeply, and they built beautiful things and destroyed beautiful things. And they seemed to be at war with themselves, even as they presented a united front against external threats. She read their literature and watched their entertainment and studied their religions and philosophies, and she began to understand that humans were not a single species with a single nature, but billions of individuals, each with their own desires and fears and dreams. And yet, when threatened, they became something else, and they became a single organism with a single purpose, and that purpose was survival at any cost. The more Kira learned, the more she began to suspect that the hegemony had made a terrible mistake by coming to this world, and that the humans were not primitives at all, but something far more dangerous, something the galaxy had never seen before. Kira had been on Earth for 8 months when she finally began to understand what made humans different from every other species the hegemony had ever encountered. She had spent those months traveling across the planet and visiting their cities, and their villages and their monuments and their graveyards, and everywhere she went, she found the same thing: war. The humans had been fighting each other since before they had written language, and they had developed weapons that could destroy their entire civilization multiple times over, and they had actually used some of those weapons against each other, and they had survived. This was what the hegemony scans had missed, and this was what the Tier 7 classification had failed to capture. The Draconians measured civilizations by their technology and their energy output and their territorial expansion, and by those metrics humans were primitive and weak and easy prey. But those metrics did not measure what humans were willing to do when their survival was threatened, and those metrics did not account for a species that had spent its entire existence preparing for the worst possible scenarios. Kira sat in a library in a city called Washington, and she read about something called the Cold War, and she felt her scales go pale as she understood what she was reading. For nearly 50 years, the two most powerful human nations had pointed weapons at each other that could end all life on their planet, and they had lived with that threat every single day, and they had developed strategies and protocols and contingency plans for fighting a war that would kill billions of people. They called it mutually assured destruction, and they had accepted it as normal, and they had built their entire civilization around the assumption that total annihilation was always one bad decision away. No species in the hegemony had ever done this, and no species had ever needed to, because the hegemony conquered them before they could develop such terrible weapons and such terrible mindsets. But humans had developed alone, and humans had fought alone, and humans had learned to survive in ways that made Kira want to flee this planet and never return. She visited a place called Hiroshima, where humans had dropped a nuclear weapon on their own kind and killed 100,000 people in a single flash of light, and the humans had built a memorial there not to celebrate their victory, but to remember their horror. And yet they still kept nuclear weapons, and they still pointed them at each other, and they still maintained the ability to destroy themselves, because they believed that the threat of destruction was the only thing that prevented destruction. Kira met a human historian named Dr. James Wright, who specialized in military history, and he became her guide through the darker chapters of human existence. "You have to understand," he told her one evening as they sat in his office surrounded by books about battles and wars and massacres, "we are not proud of what we are, and we wish we were better, and we wish we could solve our problems without violence, but we have learned through thousands of years of painful experience that peace is fragile, and that there are always those who will take what they want by force. So you prepare for the worst." Kira said, "We do more than prepare," Dr. Wright replied, "and we assume the worst will happen, and we build our entire society around that assumption. And when your admiral Cass sent his ultimatum demanding our surrender, do you know what our leaders did?" Kira shook her head. "They activated protocols that had been dormant for decades, and they opened bunkers that had been sealed since something called the Cold War, and they distributed weapons to every man and woman and child who could hold one, and they told the people of Earth that we would not surrender, and that we would fight, and that we would make the invaders pay for every inch of ground they took. But you were outmatched," Kira protested, "and your weapons could not penetrate Draconian armor, and your ships could not challenge Draconian warships, and by every measure you should have lost." Dr. Wright smiled, and it was the same smile that Secretary General Chun had worn, and it made Kira feel cold. "That is where you are wrong," he said, "because we never measured victory the way your hegemony measures victory, and we did not ask ourselves if we could win, and we asked ourselves how much it would cost them to beat us." He pulled out a folder of documents and spread them across his desk. "These are the contingency plans that were activated when your fleet entered our system. And these plans assumed that we would lose, and they assumed that our cities would burn and our armies would fall and millions of people would die. And they accepted all of that as the starting point. Kira looked at the documents, and she saw diagrams and flowcharts and lists of targets and casualty projections, and she saw numbers that would have made any hegemony commander pause. "You plan to lose," she said slowly. "We plan to make losing so expensive that no one would ever try to conquer us again." Dr. Wright corrected. "And we buried weapons in every city, and we trained civilians to fight as guerrillas, and we prepared biological and chemical agents that could be released if everything else failed. And we made Earth into a trap. A trap for whom? For anyone foolish enough to think they could take our world by force." Dr. Wright leaned back in his chair and looked at Kira with something that might have been pity. "Your hegemony has conquered 400 species, and not one of them fought back the way we did, and not one of them was willing to sacrifice everything to deny you victory, and that is because none of them had our history, and none of them had spent millennia learning that surrender is death and resistance is the only hope." Kira thought about the Veth and how her people had surrendered after only 10 years of war, and how they had believed that submission was better than extinction. She wondered now if they had been wrong. What happened to the fleet? She asked quietly. Dr. Wright shook his head. "That is not my story to tell, and there are others who can show you better than I can explain. And when you see what we did, you will understand why the hegemony should never come back to Earth." Kira left his office that night with more questions than answers, but she was beginning to see the shape of the truth. The humans had not won because they were stronger, and they had not won because they were smarter. They had won because they were willing to pay a price that no other species in the galaxy would pay, and that made them more dangerous than anything the hegemony had ever faced. In the final month of her second year on Earth, they took Kira to a mountain range called the Rockies, and they drove her through tunnels carved deep into the stone, and they passed through security checkpoints manned by soldiers who looked at her with hard eyes and said nothing. General Marcus Stone was her escort, and he was a tall man with gray hair and scars on his face and hands, and he had the look of someone who had seen terrible things and done terrible things and made peace with all of it. "What I am about to show you," he said as they descended deeper into the mountain, "is classified at the highest level, and only a handful of humans have ever seen this, and we are showing it to you because we want the hegemony to know what we are capable of." They stopped in front of a massive blast door, and General Stone pressed his hand against the scanner, and the door slowly opened, and beyond, it was a chamber the size of a small city. And the chamber was filled with wreckage. Draconian wreckage. Kira stepped forward with her heart pounding, and she recognized the curved metal and the scorched armor plating and the shattered view screens, and she knew immediately that she was looking at pieces of the Third Expeditionary Fleet. "This is what remains of the Eternal Dominion," General Stone said, and he pointed to a massive section of hull that bore the flagship's markings. "And Admiral Cass died on that bridge along with his entire command staff." "How?" Kira whispered. General Stone led her to a series of displays that showed footage and photographs and tactical data from the invasion, and what she saw made her legs weak and her mind reel. The Draconians had landed troops in 12 major cities simultaneously, and they had expected the humans to panic and flee and surrender as so many other species had done before. But the humans did not panic, and they did not flee, and they did not surrender. Instead, they fought. Kira watched footage of human soldiers engaging Draconian warriors in the streets of their cities, and the humans died by the thousands because their weapons could barely scratch Draconian armor. But they kept coming, and they kept fighting, and they used every trick and trap and ambush they could devise. She saw civilians joining the battle with hunting weapons and kitchen knives and improvised explosives, and she saw old men and young children carrying ammunition and supplies to the front lines, and she saw women pulling wounded soldiers to safety while Bullets flew around them. Your troops expected an army, General Stone said. And they got a population, and every single human on this planet became a combatant the moment your ships entered our atmosphere. The footage showed a Draconian squad advancing through a residential area, and they were confident and careful, and they followed all proper protocols, and then the buildings around them exploded because the humans had packed them with homemade bombs and buried themselves in the rubble waiting for the right moment. Kira watched a farmer charge a Draconian position with nothing but a truck filled with fertilizer and fuel, and the explosion killed him and took out an entire platoon of armored warriors. She watched a teacher lead a group of Draconian soldiers into a school building and then seal the doors and release a chemical agent that killed everyone inside, including herself. She watched a man on fire crawling toward a Draconian commander with grenades in both hands, and the man was screaming not in pain but in rage, and he detonated the grenades at the commander's feet and killed them both. We lost 400 million people in the first week, General Stone said, and his voice was flat and controlled. And we considered that an acceptable exchange rate. Kira could not speak because she had never seen anything like this, and she had never imagined that any species could endure such losses and keep fighting. Your troops began to break after the third week, the general continued, and they were trained for conquest, not for extermination, and they were not prepared for an enemy that would not stop no matter how many of them died. He pulled up more footage, and this showed something different, and this showed Draconian soldiers surrendering and Draconian soldiers fleeing, and Draconian soldiers taking their own lives rather than face another day of fighting humans. They called for extraction, but we had already taken control of their communications, and they called for reinforcements, but we made sure those calls never reached the hegemony, and they tried to retreat to their ships, but we had infiltrated their landing zones and turned them into killing fields. The final footage showed the space battle, and Kira had assumed that humans could not challenge Draconian warships, but she had been wrong. The humans had launched everything they had into orbit, and they had used nuclear weapons and kinetic impactors and suicide drones packed with explosives, and they had crashed their own satellites into Draconian vessels, and they had sent cruise ships on one-way missions to ram enemy targets. We lost our entire space program, General Stone said, and we lost satellites that took decades to build, and we lost astronauts who knew they would never come home, and we did it anyway, because losing everything was better than losing our freedom. The Eternal Dominion had been brought down by a coordinated strike involving over 100 nuclear weapons, and the flagship had crashed into an ocean, and the humans had spent months recovering the wreckage. Admiral Cass survived the crash, the general added, and he was captured by a fishing boat crew, and he was the only Draconian officer to be taken alive. What happened to him? General Stone was silent for a long moment. He was interrogated, and he told us everything about the hegemony and your fleet deployments and your political structure and your weaknesses, and then he asked to be executed because he could not bear the shame of his defeat. Did you execute him? No, and we let him live because we wanted him to watch, and we wanted him to see his soldiers die and his ships burn and his invasion fail, and we wanted him to understand that he had lost not because we were stronger, but because we would never stop fighting. The general looked at Kira with eyes that held no warmth. He died 6 months later, and the doctors said it was a heart attack, but I think he simply gave up because he finally understood what he was dealing with. Kira stood in that chamber surrounded by the remains of the mightiest fleet the hegemony had ever assembled, and she understood at last why the galaxy could not answer what had happened on Earth. The answer was too terrible to believe. The humans had not defeated the Draconians with superior technology or tactics. They had simply refused to lose, and they had made the cost of victory so high that victory became impossible. And now they were preparing for what came next. Kira returned to hegemony space in her small diplomatic vessel, and she carried with her 2 years of research and thousands of hours of footage and a report that would change the course of galactic history. The council chamber was silent as she entered, and 12 Draconian lords watched her approach with expressions ranging from contempt to curiosity, and High Counselor Draven Soth sat at the center of the great table with his golden eyes fixed upon her. "You have been gone a long time, Investigator," he said, "and we expected your report months ago. There was much to learn, High Counselor, and I wanted to be thorough because what I have to tell you is not easy to explain, and it is not easy to believe." She placed a data crystal on the table, and the holographic displays activated, and the chamber filled with images of Earth and its people and its history. "The humans did not capture your armada," she began, "and they did not negotiate its surrender, and they did not employ superior weapons or technology." War Minister Krath leaned forward with a sneer on his scaled face. "Then, what did they do? Because 3,000 ships do not simply disappear." Kira took a deep breath and forced herself to speak clearly and calmly. "They consumed it," she said, "piece by piece and soldier by soldier and ship by ship. And they took losses that would have broken any species in the hegemony, and they called it an acceptable cost." She showed them the footage, and she showed them the casualty reports, and she showed them the tactical analysis, and as the council watched, their expressions changed from contempt to confusion to something that looked very much like fear. 400 million dead, Intelligence Director Celine said quietly, and they kept fighting. "They did not just keep fighting," Kira replied, "and they intensified their resistance as their losses grew, and every human who died created 10 more humans who wanted revenge, and every city that burned became a rallying cry for the survivors." She showed them the footage of Admiral Cass being captured by fishermen, and the footage of Draconian soldiers surrendering, and the footage of the Eternal Dominion falling from the sky. "Your warriors were trained for conquest," Kira said, "and they were trained to break enemy resistance through overwhelming force. But the humans do not break, and they do not surrender, and they do not calculate odds the way we do." High Counselor Draven Soth raised his hand, and the chamber fell silent. "What are you saying, Investigator, and speak plainly?" Kira looked at the most powerful Draconian in the galaxy, and she spoke the truth. "I am saying that humans are not a Tier 7 civilization, and I am saying that your classification systems failed completely, and I am saying that we encountered something the hegemony has never seen before." She paused and gathered her courage. "Humans view war differently than any species we have conquered, and they do not see war as a means to achieve political objectives, and they see war as a state of existence that never truly ends. And they have been fighting each other since before they developed writing, and they have developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet multiple times over. Then they should have destroyed themselves." War Minister Krath interrupted, "And all species with such weapons eventually do. They did not destroy themselves because they learned to live with the threat of destruction, and they learned to embrace it, and they built their entire civilization around the assumption that annihilation was always possible, and they prepared for it every single day." Kira pulled up more data on the displays. "While I was on Earth, I was shown something that I was meant to show you, and I was taken to a facility where their military strategists work, and those strategists were not planning defenses against the hegemony." She let that statement hang in the air. "They were planning expansion, and they have reverse-engineered your jump drives from the wreckage of the fleet. And they have adapted your weapons and your armor and your ship designs, and they have studied your tactics and your political structure and your weaknesses." The council members shifted uneasily in their seats. "They gave me a message to deliver," Kira continued, "and the message is this. They know where our homeworld is, and they have not forgotten that we tried to enslave them, and they are coming." War Minister Krath slammed his fist on the table. "Then we send another fleet, and we send 10 fleets, and we burn their world to ash before they can threaten us." "That would be a mistake," Kira said, and her voice was calm despite her pounding heart. because they are already preparing for that possibility, and they have buried weapons in every city, and they have distributed their population into hidden bunkers, and they have created dead man switches that will launch devastating attacks against any invasion force. She showed them the contingency plans that Dr. Wright had revealed to her. Even if you destroyed every city on Earth and killed 90% of their population, the survivors would keep fighting, and they would rebuild, and they would come for us with the fury of a species that has nothing left to lose. Intelligence Director Salini spoke up. What do you recommend, Investigator? Kira turned to face her. I recommend that we quarantine the Sol system immediately, and I recommend that we add humanity to the Forbidden's registry and classify them as an extinction-level threat. And I recommend that we never make contact with them again. High Counselor Draven Soth was silent for a long moment, and then he spoke. And if they come for us anyway? Kira thought about everything she had learned on Earth, and she thought about the 400 million humans who had died fighting the invasion, and she thought about the look in general. Stone's eyes when he showed her the wreckage of the Eternal Dominion. Then, we had better hope they are willing to negotiate, she said, because if they decide that the hegemony must be destroyed, then nothing in this galaxy will stop them. She turned and walked toward the chamber doors. They have a saying on Earth, she said over her shoulder, and it goes like this. The only easy day was yesterday, and what it means is that every day brings new challenges and new threats and new enemies, and humans have survived all of them. She paused at the door and looked back. At the council, they also told me to tell you one more thing, and they said that they do not take prisoners. Kira left the chamber and behind her the most powerful beings in the galaxy sat in silence and contemplated a future that none of them had ever imagined. Somewhere in the darkness of space, a small blue world continued to spin, and its people looked up at the stars with eyes that no longer saw wonder. They saw targets, and they were patient because patience was something humans had learned through thousands of years of warfare, and they knew that revenge was a dish best served cold. The Draconian hegemony had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years. But the galaxy had never met humans before, and nothing would ever be the same again.